morning. There's a story about Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was a Russian novelist, and it's a story of how he was arrested, he along with others, as dissidents, and convicted of treason and sentenced to death. On his last day, they get up, they're showered, they're brought in and have their final breakfast, their final meal. They're marched across the parade grounds and lined up against a wall. And they can see just in front of them the Russian soldiers with their guns, their rifles. Masks are put over their heads, and then a chaplain says a prayer, and then the commander gives the command. They hear the rifles lifted, and then the explosion of the guns, and they feel nothing. Confused and wondering what's going on, Dostoevsky has his mask taken off. And the commander says that they are free. That this is a warning to them. This is what is going to happen if you persist in what you're doing. You're warned. Next time it'll be real. Dostoevsky recalls that last day of his life, that day where he got up for his execution. He showered and felt the water on his body, the beautiful sense of the water. He felt the clothes he put on, the fabrics. He ate his breakfast and tasted every mouthful as if it was his last, and the coffee never tasted so good. He walked across the parade ground, and the sun on his face and body felt wonderful. It never looked so bright, and the trees never looked so green. The colours were alive, his senses were alive. He saw what he'd never seen before. And his life was changed. He could never go back to the way he was. The minor trifles and conflicts and struggles of life seemed insignificant now. He faced death and was given life, and he lived differently. And I think that's a story of resurrection, and it takes place in the midst of struggle and pain and death. There's a dying that has to happen in order for a rising, a resurrection to happen, and it's built into life and the way we experience life. And this weekend we hear the story of Jesus, his death on the cross, and the resurrection experience that's written about by followers, by these gospel writers and Paul and others in the New Testament. Trying to make sense of this mystery, this confusing experience. This Christ who is dead but who is alive in a new and strange and mysterious way, whose presence they feel and know in all manner of ways. The stories we read, John speaks of Mary and the disciples going to the tomb, and this story of an empty tomb, this death cannot contain this one Christ. Where is he? What is this about? It doesn't make sense. And Mary looking in the garden, asking a gardener, did you take the body? And not recognizing until she hears her name called Mary. And she recognizes in this experience, this is the one, this is the Christ. But she can't touch him because he's not who he was. And the disciples that night in an upper room, Jesus comes in their midst, this risen Christ, appears through locked doors and walls, appears to them and breathes on them peace. Or the disciples leaving Jerusalem, confused about what's happening, grief-stricken, talking about this one who's promised so much but now is dead. And they meet this stranger who just appears alongside them along the way. And they talk, and he makes sense and he explains. And then he goes to keep going when they arrive at their home. They invite him in. And they talk more and they sit around the table, and he takes bread and breaks it in praise. And their eyes are open and they experience this risen Christ in their midst in this strange way, in this meal of communion. In so many ways, whether it's Paul who sees a vision of light and hears sound and whose life is changed, who goes from one who's controlling and dominating and violent and persecuting Christians to one who says that in Christ there are no barriers and divisions, that these divisions and barriers we know in our lives break down. In Christ there are no male and female, slave and free, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, and any other barriers we want to name. Whose life and whose thinking and whose way of being is changed dramatically, like Dostoevsky. And this resurrection takes place in the midst of struggle often. In the midst of grief for the disciples who hope so deeply in Jesus that he would be the one, that he would be able to bring freedom and life, and then he's dead. What does it mean? And in the midst of this death, this end of everything, in the midst of a moment where there is no hope, they experience this presence of the risen Christ. With them, in them, through them, around them. And they don't know what it means, except God is here. Resurrection is an experience in our lives, made real by this presence of Christ, if you like. It comes into us. You know, the bush following bushfire regenerates. What was dead becomes alive. In the midst of grief or pain or tragedy or suffering, in a world where Russian armies now invade Ukraine, or there's conflicts in the Middle East, tribal warfare in Africa, or in the streets of Sydney or Los Angeles or wherever, where someone is killed in a brawl, the Easter show, where there are gangland shootings, where there is violence in the home, and children and young people and women in particular experience violence, sexual, physical, verbal, psychological violence. In a world where there's grief, where we know the grief of death, people we love die, and as we sit with them in that moment of the heat and life draining from them. We know grief and pain and aloneness. And it's in those moments when we wonder, how can we go on? What can we do? How can life ever be what it was again? Can we live? Can these bones live? Can anything live? It's in the midst of the grief and the pain, the humility, the vulnerability, that we recognise we can't do it. We can't do it alone. We can't save ourselves. We can't fix it. We can't save those poor people we see on the news in Ukraine. We can't relieve the people in the floods. We can't fix their homes or stop the floodwaters or stop the fire. We're helpless. We can't do it alone. And it's in that moment that maybe we reach out to the one who can help us. And I guess it's in the moment of vulnerability and humility where we recognise our own limitations and we let go of the pretense that we are in control, that we know what to do and we can do it. We let go and we feel helpless and powerless. And in our vulnerability, this risen Christ is present. And there is strength there. Strength to sustain us. There is strength as other people embrace us, as we're embraced into a community that cares and loves and journeys with us, with other people. This is what resurrection is about. It's about finding new life and hope in the midst of death. The death we feel, whatever that presence of death feels like. That absence of hope, or the absence of life, or the absence of vitality. Resurrection comes. And it often comes through a community that holds us. I remember hearing an interview with Bill Cruz, the Uniting Church Minister in Nashville with the Exodus Foundation. He spoke of how life was incredibly hard. His marriage had broken down, and there was difficulties and struggles, and I think he was burning out in some ways. And he was off overseas with one of the projects that they fund and support with refugees, and the work was hard and tiring, and he felt so alone in his life that felt like it was crumbling around him. He just wanted to be with people. And he was walking out in the streets, and he saw this sign for an AA meeting, and he thought, there were people there, I just got to go in. And he went in, and there's a group of people, and they're sitting in a circle, and he grabs a seat and sits. And people are telling their stories, and it's translated from whatever language to English, and he's listening in and absorbed in their stories and their pain. And he realises that the stories are coming around closer to him, and that soon he's going to have to speak. But he's not an alcoholic. What's he going to say? And when it got to him, he didn't know what to say. My name's Bill, and I'm not an alcoholic, but... And then it all just blurted out. All the pain and the struggle and the dysfunction and the confusion and the chaos, it all just poured out of him, along with the tears and the angst and everything that he felt. He said, when I finished, I sat there vulnerable, and they gathered round me, and in their own ways they prayed. They did this prayer, which was praying but not praying, but it was prayer. And he said they listened, they understood, and they gave me my life back. They gave me my life back. I was raised from the ashes. Out of the pain of my life, I found new hope, resurrection. And I hear so many stories of people who come out of addictions, following 12-step programs, recognising that they have a need that they can't save themselves, being encouraged to reach out to the higher power. For some, it's a higher sense of wisdom or insight. For others, it's a higher power that they name as God. And the community around them holds their pain and their vulnerability. And they learn to pray and trust. And out of their lowest points, where everything has fallen apart, they receive new life. It's a day-by-day existence. But there's always people there to contact and support and help, to check up. There's a community that journeys with them. And there's a higher power, God, a risen Christ, who comes in flesh and blood, who comes in spirit, who comes in our darkest moments and offers hope. And that's resurrection. And that's what we celebrate this week. That Christ is with us in everything. And that Christ is present in the world, in the buds and new flowers that burst open and brighten our lives, in the new sun that shines, even in the midst of rains and the dark clouds. There is a sun. And one day it will break through and dry things out. In the midst of war and the deep pain and tragedy and horror, God is present in the suffering, holding people in their deepest moments and darkest moments. A love that is released in the world that can never be overcome, even by the violence and evil and horror that humans inflict on each other. God knows that suffering. He's in that suffering and holds us through the suffering. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. They hold me, and they lead me into new life. I pray that as you think through and ponder resurrection and look around you in your life and the life of others, in the life of the world, seeing the signs and the images of resurrection through song and art, through life and people, through the stories, the tears and the laughter, gathering around that table like those early disciples and experiencing the risen Christ in our midst. May God be with you and bring new life and hope.